When desperate widower Colt Merriman posted for a ranch cook, he expected a grizzled cowhand, not a sunburned woman with a newborn strapped to her chest. What started as one night's test in a Texas panhandle kitchen became a battle against drought, kidnappers, and two hearts too broken to believe in second chances. This is the story of how a single mother's cooking saved a dying ranch, and how a cattle baron learned that some wounds only heal when you let someone new tend the fire. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Texas Panhandle didn't forgive weakness. It broke men the way wind breaks stone, slowly, inevitably, without mercy. Colt Merriman had learned that lesson twice. Once when the drought of '81 killed half his herd, and again 3 years later when pneumonia took his wife, leaving him alone in a ranch house that echoed with nothing but his own footsteps and the howling wind. Now, in the autumn of 1887, he sat at the head of an empty dining table, staring at a plate of something that might have once been stew. The meat was gray, the potatoes had the consistency of wet cardboard. Somewhere in the mess hall, his ranch hands were eating the same slop, and their complaints had grown from grumbling to outright mutiny. "Boss?" Colt looked up. His foreman, Wade Hutchins, stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Wade was a good man, loyal, hardworking, never complained, which meant if Wade was here, things were bad. "Spit it out," Colt said. "The men are talking about leaving," Wade said quietly. "Not because of the work, not because of the pay, because of the food." Colt pushed his plate away. "It's that bad?" "Worse. Young Billy threw up after supper last night. Doc Jensen says half the crew has stomach troubles, and this morning someone found a rat in the beans." Colt's jaw tightened. The ranch cook, Old Pete, had been with him for 15 years, but Pete's eyesight was failing, his hands shook, and somewhere along the way he'd forgotten the difference between seasoning and punishment. "Where's Pete now?" "In town, visiting his daughter. Said he needed a break." Wade shifted his weight. "Boss, I don't think he's coming back." The silence stretched between them. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance. The wind rattled the windows. Colt had built this ranch from nothing. 6,000 acres of hard prairie, 500 head of cattle, a crew of 20 men who depended on him for their livelihood. He'd survived drought, disease, and the death of everything he'd ever loved, but he couldn't survive without a cook. "I'll handle it," Colt said finally. Wade nodded and left. Colt sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the house creak and settle around him. Then he pulled out a piece of paper and wrote 4 lines in his rough, blocky handwriting. Wanted, cook, capable, enduring. Apply in person at Merriman Ranch, 12 miles north of Dalhart. Good pay for good work. He posted the notice in town the next morning, tacked it to the wall outside the general store, the saloon, and the feed depot. Then he waited. 3 days passed. Nobody came. On the 4th day, a drifter showed up, filthy, drunk, claiming he'd once worked in a hotel kitchen in St. Louis. Colt sent him packing when the man couldn't explain why he'd been fired. On the 5th day, 2 more applicants arrived. One was a boy barely old enough to shave, who admitted he'd never cooked for more than his own family. The other was a man who wanted twice the going rate and refused to work Sundays. Colt turned them both away. By the 6th day, he'd started to wonder if he'd have to ride to Amarillo and drag someone back by force. The men were eating hardtack and jerky, supplemented by whatever Wade could scrounge from the cellar. It was keeping them alive, but barely. And the complaints had started again, louder this time. "We signed on to punch cattle, not starve," one hand had said that morning. "You don't fix this, boss. You'll be working this spread alone." Colt knew he was right. So on the 7th day, when he saw a figure approaching through the shimmering heat of the prairie, he stood from the porch and shaded his eyes, half expecting another disappointment. The figure resolved slowly. A woman, walking. No horse, no wagon. Just walking, with the kind of determined stride that spoke of desperation or stubbornness, possibly both. As she drew closer, Colt saw she was young, maybe 25, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of dried prairie grass tied back in a hasty braid. Her dress was plain, patched in places, covered with trail dust, and clutched against her chest, wrapped in a faded quilt, was a baby. Colt's stomach sank. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, breathing hard but steady. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that came from walking too far on too little sleep, but her eyes were clear and determined, the color of creek water in summer. "Are you married, man?" she asked. "I am." "I'm here about the job." For a long moment, Colt just stared at her. Then he said, "You can't be serious." "I can cook," she said, "and I need a place to stay." Didn't say nothing about women in that posting. Didn't say I couldn't handle men, either. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, without a trace of pleading. Most women would have tried charm or tears. She was offering neither. "Ma'am," Colt said carefully, "this is a cattle ranch. 20 men, most of them rough as boot leather. They work hard, eat like horses, and don't have much patience for what?" She shifted the baby higher on her shoulder. "For someone who can turn flour and lard into something that won't poison them? For meals that don't come with rat droppings?" Colt's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "Man in town told me, said you were desperate." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm desperate too, but at least I can cook." "What's your name?" "Abigail Rose. This is Thomas." She glanced down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully despite the heat and the flies. "Where's your husband?" "Dead." The word landed flat and final between them. Colt knew that tone. He'd used it himself when people asked about his wife. "How'd you get here?" "Walked from Dalhart." "That's 12 miles." "I know." Colt rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble rasp under his palm. Every instinct told him to send her away. A woman on a ranch full of men was trouble waiting to happen. A woman with a baby was worse. He had enough problems without adding complications, but the men were threatening to leave. Pete wasn't coming back. And something in the way Abigail Rose stood there, tired but unbowed, desperate but not defeated, reminded him of the women who'd settled this land in the first place, the kind who could face down storms and stillbirths and never once thought about quitting. "You ever cooked for a crew before?" he asked. "I cooked for a boarding house in Amarillo, 40 men, 3 meals a day." "Why'd you leave?" Her jaw tightened. The owner wanted more than cooking. Colt understood. He'd known men like that, the kind who saw a woman's desperation and decided it was an invitation. "You got references?" "No." She said it without shame or apology. "But I'll work for free tonight. You can judge for yourself." It was a bold offer. And in Colt's experience, people who made bold offers either had supreme confidence or nothing left to lose. He suspected Abigail Rose was both. "1 meal?" he said finally. "You cook supper tonight. If the men don't riot, you stay. If they do, you're gone by morning. Deal?" "Deal." "Kitchen's through there." He pointed toward the side of the house. "You'll find what's left of the supplies in the pantry. It ain't much." "I'll make do." She climbed the porch steps, moving carefully with the baby in her arms. As she passed him, Colt caught a faint scent of rosemary and wood smoke, like she'd been sleeping near campfires. She didn't look back as she disappeared into the house. Colt stood alone on the porch, wondering what the hell he'd just agreed to. By mid-afternoon, smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. Colt tried to focus on work, checking fence lines, inspecting the water troughs, reviewing the breeding records with Wade. But his mind kept drifting back to the house, wondering what was happening in that kitchen. He'd given her scraps to work with, some flour that was half weevil, salt pork that had seen better days, a few withered potatoes, dried beans that had been in the cellar since God knew when. If she could make something edible out of that, she was either a miracle worker or a witch. Around 5 o'clock, one of the younger hands, Billy Murphy, came running up to Colt in the barn. "Boss," Billy panted, "you better come see." "See what?" "The kitchen. Something's happening." Colt followed him back to the house, half expecting to find the place on fire. Instead, he found a miracle. The kitchen, which had been a disaster zone of unwashed pots and mysterious stains, was spotless. The old iron stove glowed with heat. Every surface had been scrubbed. And the smell? Colt stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned. It smelled like bread. Real bread with yeast and warmth and that unmistakable aroma That meant someone was actually cooking instead of just heating things until they stopped moving. Abigail stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, hair escaping from its braid in damp wisps. The baby was asleep in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate and some folded blankets, positioned in the corner where she could keep an eye on him. She was stirring a massive pot with one hand while using the other to flip something in a skillet. "How much food you planning to make?" Colt asked. She didn't look up. "You said 20 men?" "About that." "Then I'm making enough for 30. Men who've been eating garbage will eat twice what they normally do when they finally get real food." "You sound pretty confident." "I am." She tasted the contents of the pot, frowned, added something from a small pouch at her belt, tasted again, and nodded. "This'll be ready in an hour. You might want to warn them." "Warn them?" "That supper's actually going to be worth showing up for." Colt leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. She moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Her hands were quick and sure, chopping, stirring, seasoning. She'd found things he didn't even know were in the pantry: dried herbs, molasses, a bit of bacon fat. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother. She ran a tavern in Tennessee before we moved west." Abigail pulled a pan of cornbread from the oven, golden and perfect. She said cooking was the only magic poor women were allowed to practice. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." The past tense hung heavy. "She died when I was 16. Cholera." "I'm sorry." "Me too." She set the cornbread aside to cool. "But she taught me enough to survive. That's more than some folks get." Colt nodded slowly. He'd lost his own mother young, to childbirth. His father had raised him and his brother alone, teaching them that sentiment was weakness and work was salvation. When his father finally died, kicked by a horse and too stubborn to see a doctor, Colt had inherited the ranch and the philosophy that went with it. Work hard. Don't complain. Don't expect help. He'd lived by those rules for 40 years, and it had made him successful, lonely, but successful. "I'll go tell the men," he said, pushing off from the doorframe. "Mr. Merriman?" He turned back. Abigail was looking at him now, and there was something fierce in her expression. "I know you're taking a risk on me," she said. "I won't let you down." "We'll see," Colt said. But as he walked away, he found himself hoping, against all reason and experience, that she was right. Wait. At 6 o'clock, the dinner bell rang. The ranch hands came slouching toward the mess hall with the enthusiasm of men walking to their own execution. Colt stood near the door, watching them file in with slumped shoulders and resigned expressions. "If this is more of Pete's cooking," one man muttered, "I'm riding to Amarillo tonight and never coming back." "Can't be worse than yesterday," another replied. "I think I saw something move in my stew." They settled into their usual seats around the long wooden tables, talking in low voices, not expecting much. Then Wade opened the kitchen door, and everything stopped. Abigail emerged carrying a massive pot of stew. Behind her, Billy Murphy carried a tray loaded with cornbread. The smell hit the room like a physical force. 20 men went completely silent. She moved down the table, ladling stew into bowls. Colt watched their faces change, suspicion giving way to confusion, then disbelief, then something close to reverence. "Is that actual meat?" one hand whispered. "And vegetables," another said. "Real ones." "Sweet Jesus, is that cornbread?" Abigail served them all without comment, her face calm and professional. When every man had a full bowl, she stepped back. "Eat," she said simply. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the older hands, a grizzled cowboy named Sutton, picked up his spoon and took a cautious bite. His eyes widened. "Good God Almighty," he breathed. That broke the spell. 20 men fell on their food like starving wolves. Spoons clattered against bowls, cornbread disappeared in massive bites. Within minutes, men were going back for seconds, then thirds. Colt served himself last, sitting at the head of the table. He took a spoonful of stew and understood immediately why his men looked like they'd been touched by divine intervention. It was good. Not just edible, actually good. The meat was tender, falling apart under his spoon. The vegetables had been cooked perfectly, soft but not mushy. And the broth, there was something in the broth, some combination of herbs and seasoning that made it taste like home, like memory, like his wife used to make back before everything fell apart. Colt set down his spoon carefully, afraid of what he might feel if he kept eating. Across the room, Abigail was cleaning up, wiping down surfaces, checking on her sleeping baby. She worked quietly, efficiently, not seeking praise or attention. But when Wade stood up and cleared his throat, she paused. "Ma'am," Wade said, and every man in the room turned to look. "I don't know what you did to that pantry, but, well, that's the best meal we've had in 3 years." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crew. "Best meal I've had in my life," Billy added, "and my ma's a fine cook." "Damn sight better than Pete," Sutton said. "No offense to Pete, but facts are facts." Abigail looked at them all, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Colt saw her smile. It was small, tired, but genuine. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "You staying?" Wade asked, glancing at Colt. "Boss, tell me she's staying." All eyes turned to Colt. He could feel the weight of their collective hope pressing against him. These were hard men, tough men, who rarely asked for anything. But they were asking now. Colt thought about the empty kitchen, the threat of mutiny, the long string of failures and disappointments that had led him to this moment. Then he looked at Abigail Rose, exhausted, determined, standing in his kitchen with a baby in a crate and nothing but her own skills to bargain with. "She's staying," Colt said. The cheer that went up shook the rafters. Men clapped and whooped, pounding the table with their fists. Abigail's smile widened, just a fraction, and Colt saw her shoulders relax for the first time since she'd arrived. "On one condition," Colt added, and the room quieted. "Nobody bothers her. She's here to cook, not to be courted or harassed or made uncomfortable. Any man who forgets that answers to me. Clear?" "Clear, boss," Wade said, and the others nodded their agreement. "Good. Now finish eating and get back to work. Those fences won't mend themselves." The men returned to their meals with renewed enthusiasm. Colt stood, carried his empty bowl to the kitchen, and found Abigail standing by the wash basin, staring out the window at the darkening prairie. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a chance. Thank you for not making me regret it." Colt set his bowl down. "You'll sleep in the spare room off the kitchen. It's small, but it's private. You and the baby should be comfortable enough." "That's generous. It's practical. Can't have you falling asleep in the stew because you're exhausted." He paused. "Breakfast is at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. You'll have Sundays off, and I'll pay you $20 a month plus room and board." Her eyes widened. "That's more than—" "That's what you're worth. Take it or leave it." "I'll take it." "Then we have a deal, Miss Rose." He extended his hand. She shook it, her grip firm and calloused. For just a moment their eyes met, and Colt felt something shift, some small adjustment in the foundation of his carefully ordered life. Then he released her hand and walked out into the night, leaving her alone with the dirty dishes and the sleeping baby and the kitchen that still smelled like hope. That night, Colt lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt different. There was someone else living here now, someone who wasn't a hired hand or a temporary visitor. Abigail and her baby were just down the hall, separated from him by 2 thin walls and a lifetime of grief. He could hear her moving around, the soft sounds of someone settling into a new place. Water running, floorboards creaking, the muffled cry of the baby quickly soothed. Colt closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but memories kept surfacing. His wife, Sarah, had died in this house. In the bedroom across the hall, the one he'd locked up and never entered again. She'd been sick for weeks, burning with fever, coughing until she couldn't breathe. The doctor had tried everything, bloodletting, medicines, poultices, but nothing worked. In the end, she'd died on a cold November morning, with Colt holding her hand and promising things he knew he couldn't deliver. "Take care of yourself," she'd whispered. "Don't lock yourself away." But he had, because it was easier than facing the emptiness. Now, 3 years later, that emptiness had become so familiar, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone else in the house, to hear footsteps that weren't his own, to smell cooking that actually tasted like food instead of punishment. Around midnight, Colt heard his door creak open. He sat up, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept beside the bed, But it was just Abigail standing in the doorway with a steaming cup in her hands. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said softly. "I heard you coughing earlier. Thought you might need this." She set the cup on his bedside table, then turned to leave. "What is it?" Colt asked. "Mint tea with honey and a few other things. It'll help with the cough." "I don't have a cough." "You do. I heard it during supper. You've been breathing shallow all evening." She paused in the doorway. "Drink it. Trust me." Then she was gone, disappearing back into the darkness of the hallway. Colt stared at the cup for a long moment. Steam rose from it in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of mint and something else, something herbal and faintly medicinal. He picked it up, took a cautious sip, and felt the warmth spread through his chest. It was good, soothing, and as he drank, he realized his chest did hurt a little, had been hurting for days. He'd ignored it, the way he ignored most things related to his own well-being. But Abigail hadn't ignored it. She'd noticed, she'd cared, and she'd done something about it. Colt finished the tea, set the cup aside, and lay back down. Within minutes, the tightness in his chest had eased. His breathing deepened, and for the first time in months, he fell asleep without spending hours staring at the darkness. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The cattle lowed in their pens, and somewhere in the spare room off the kitchen, a woman who'd walked 12 miles with a baby in her arms finally allowed herself to believe she might have found something worth staying for. The next morning, Colt woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face, and followed the smell to the kitchen. Abigail was already working, moving between the stove and the counter with practiced efficiency. The baby was awake, cooing softly in his makeshift cradle. "Morning?" Colt said. "Morning." She didn't look up from the eggs she was scrambling. "Coffee's on the table. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. Colt poured himself a cup and sat down, watching her work. In the early morning light, he could see details he'd missed yesterday. The faint scar on her forearm, the calluses on her hands, the way she unconsciously hummed while she cooked. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. "Better than I have in weeks." She glanced at him. "How's your cough?" "Gone." "Good." She returned to her work, satisfied. "You should keep drinking the tea, once a night for a few more days, just to be sure." "Yes, ma'am." Was that a smile? Just a flicker at the corner of her mouth? The mess hall bell rang at 5 o'clock sharp, and the men came stumbling in, most of them still half asleep. But when they saw the breakfast spread, eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy, and fresh coffee, they woke up fast. "Lord have mercy," Sutton muttered. "It wasn't a dream." "Best start getting used to it," Wade said, grinning. "Miss Rose is sticking around." The men ate with the same enthusiasm they'd shown at supper, and Colt watched them transform. They sat up straighter, talked louder, smiled more. Good food did that. Reminded men they were human instead of just machines for working cattle. After breakfast, as the crew filed out to start their day, Wade lingered behind. "Boss," he said quietly, "can I have a word?" Colt nodded and they stepped out onto the porch. "I just wanted to say," Wade began, "bringing her on was the right call. The men are already talking about how this feels like a real ranch again instead of a prison camp." "It's just food, Wade." "No, sir, it's not." Wade looked out at the prairie where the sun was just starting to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "It's what food represents. It's care. Attention. Someone giving a damn whether we live or die." He turned back to Colt. "That woman, she's got a gift. And I think she might be exactly what this place needs." Colt wanted to argue, to insist that a good cook didn't change anything fundamental. But he couldn't. Because he'd woken up this morning without a cough, in a house that smelled like coffee instead of dust. And for the first time in 3 years, he hadn't felt completely alone. "Just make sure the men remember what I said," Colt replied. "She's here to work, not to be bothered." "Yes, sir." Wade headed off to supervise the day's work, leaving Colt alone with his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, he could see Abigail washing dishes, the baby strapped to her back in some kind of sling she'd fashioned. She was singing softly, something he couldn't quite make out, but it had the rhythm of an old hymn. Colt turned away and walked toward the barn, telling himself that nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. Everything had changed, and he wasn't sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands, too fast to hold, but slow enough to notice every drop. The ranch transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The mess hall, once a place of silent suffering, became somewhere men actually wanted to be. They showed up early for meals, lingering over coffee, talking and laughing in ways they hadn't in years. Abigail fed them cornbread that melted on the tongue, stews rich with herbs nobody could name, biscuits so light they seemed to defy gravity itself. But it wasn't just the food that changed things. One morning, Colt found her behind the barn, on her knees in the dirt, the baby asleep nearby in a basket she'd woven from prairie grass. She'd cleared a small patch of earth and was pressing seeds into the soil with careful fingers. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Planting." "I can see that. What are you planting?" "Herbs, mint, sage, thyme, rosemary. Maybe some vegetables if there's time before the first freeze." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "A kitchen garden. Every proper ranch should have one." Colt looked at the hard-packed earth, the stubborn clay soil that had defeated Sarah's attempts at gardening years ago. "Nothing grows here. Ground's too tough." "So were you, apparently." Abigail met his eyes with that steady gaze of hers. "But here we are." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wasting her time, but something stopped him. Maybe the determination in her face, maybe the memory of his wife kneeling in this same spot, trying to coax life from dead ground. "You need anything?" he asked instead. "Manure. Lots of it. And water. I'll have Wade bring some over." "Thank you." She returned to her planting, and Colt walked away feeling oddly unsettled. That night, he stood at his bedroom window and watched her work by lantern light, whispering to the seeds as if she could will them into growing through sheer faith alone. It was foolish, impractical, a waste of effort. But 2 weeks later, when the first green shoots pushed through the soil, Colt found himself checking the garden every morning, watching those impossible plants reach toward the sun. The men noticed too. They'd pause on their way to work, staring at that small patch of defiant green in the middle of all that brown. Some of them started helping, bringing water, building a low fence to keep out the rabbits, asking Abigail what she needed. "It's like she's teaching the ground to hope again," Billy said one evening, his young face serious in the firelight. Colt didn't reply, but he understood, because he felt it too, that dangerous, foolish thing called hope, creeping in through the cracks in his carefully maintained armor. The real trouble started on a Tuesday. Colt was in the north pasture, checking the cattle, when one of the younger hands came galloping up on horseback, his face pale. "Boss, it's Tommy Wilson. He's bad sick." Colt's gut clenched. Tommy was barely 19, fresh from Kansas, still learning the ropes. "What happened?" "Don't know. He was fine this morning. Then around noon he started shaking and sweating. Now he can't even stand up. Wade thinks maybe he ate something poisonous." Colt was already moving toward his horse. "Get Doc Randall from town." "That's 2 hours there and 2 hours back, boss. I don't think Tommy's got 4 hours." Colt swung into the saddle, his mind racing through options. They were too far from town, too isolated. If Tommy had been poisoned by bad water or toxic plants, they needed help now. When they reached the ranch house, Colt found Tommy lying in the bunkhouse, convulsing. His skin was gray, his lips blue. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. Wade and 2 other hands were trying to hold him down. "Jesus," Colt breathed. "It's spurgeweed," Wade said grimly. "Has to be. I found some growing near where he was working this morning. Must have chewed on it without thinking." Spurgeweed, also called vomit weed, for good reason. Cattle knew to avoid it instinctively, but men sometimes made mistakes. And once the toxins got into your system, there wasn't much anyone could do except pray and wait. "Where's Miss Rose?" Colt asked suddenly. "In the kitchen, I think. Why?" Colt didn't answer. He ran toward the house, boots pounding on the hard ground. He found Abigail kneading bread dough, the baby propped up on the counter in his basket, watching his mother with solemn eyes. "I need your help," Colt said. She looked up, read his face, and immediately wiped her hands on her apron. "What happened?" "One of my men, spurgeweed poisoning. Doc's too far away." Most women would have backed away, made excuses, said they didn't know how to help. Abigail simply picked up her baby, thrust him into Colt's arms, and started gathering things from around the kitchen: jars, pouches, a small knife. "What are you doing?" Colt asked, suddenly holding 20 pounds of confused infant. "What I learned to do." She moved with swift efficiency, filling a basket with her supplies. "My mother didn't just run a tavern. She was a healer, taught me plants before she taught me cooking." She paused at the door. "You coming?" Colt followed, awkwardly cradling the baby, who had started to whimper. "I don't know how to—" "Just hold him, he won't break." They hurried to the bunkhouse. The men parted to let Abigail through, their faces skeptical but desperate. She knelt beside Tommy, who was barely conscious now, his breathing shallow and rapid. "How long ago did he ingest it?" she asked. "Maybe 2 hours," Wade said. "Good, still time." She opened her basket, pulling out dried leaves and roots. "I need boiling water, a clean cloth, and someone get me fresh mint from the garden, the whole plant, roots and all." The men scattered to follow her orders. Colt stood in the corner, still holding the baby, watching Abigail work with the same focused intensity she brought to cooking. She crushed herbs in a small mortar, mixed them with something dark and pungent, added hot water when it arrived. "This is going to taste terrible," she told Tommy, lifting his head. "But you need to drink it, all of it." Tommy tried to turn his face away, but she was firm, coaxing and commanding in equal measure. Somehow, she got most of the mixture down his throat. Then she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and began massaging his abdomen in slow circles. "What's that supposed to do?" Sutton asked. "Help his body expel the poison. The herbs will make him vomit. That's good. It means the toxins are coming out." She worked steadily, never stopping, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or memory. The baby squirmed in Colt's arms, making soft, fussy sounds. Without thinking, Colt started rocking gently, the way he'd seen Abigail do. The baby quieted, gripping Colt's finger with surprising strength. For the next 3 hours, Abigail didn't leave Tommy's side. She made him drink more of her bitter medicine. She kept him cool when he burned with fever, warm when he shook with chills. Twice, he vomited violently, green bile that reeked of poison, and each time she cleaned him up without complaint, telling him he was doing well, that his body was fighting. Around midnight, Tommy's breathing finally evened out. The gray cast left his skin. His eyes opened, confused but clear. What happened?" he croaked. "You tried to die," Abigail said gently, "but we wouldn't let you." A ragged cheer went up from the men who'd been watching all night. Wade clapped Colt on the shoulder so hard the baby startled and began to cry. "She saved him," Wade said, his voice rough with emotion. "By God, she actually saved him." Abigail stood slowly, swaying with exhaustion. Her dress was stained with vomit and sweat. Her hair had come completely loose. She looked like she'd been through a battle, which, Colt supposed, she hissed. "He needs rest," she said, "and water. Small sips, nothing heavy for a few days." She turned to Colt. "Can I have my son back now?" Colt looked down and realized he'd been holding the baby for hours. Thomas had fallen asleep against his chest, one tiny fist curled into Colt's shirt. Something shifted in Colt's chest, something painful and tender at the same time. "Yeah," he said quietly, carefully transferring the sleeping baby back to his mother. "Yeah, of course." Their hands brushed during the exchange, and for just a moment Abigail's fingers lingered against his. Then she pulled away, cradling Thomas close. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me." "Thank you," Colt replied, "for knowing what to do." She smiled, tired but genuine. Then she walked out of the bunkhouse, back toward the main house, leaving behind a room full of men who looked at her with something close to awe. "Boss," Billy said into the silence, "where the hell did you find her?" Colt thought about Abigail appearing out of the prairie dust, desperate and determined, offering to work for free just for a chance. "She found me," he said. That night, Colt couldn't sleep. His arms still felt strange, like they remembered the weight of the baby. His hand still tingled from where Abigail's fingers had touched his. He got up, pulled on his pants, and walked through the quiet house. He found himself standing outside the locked bedroom, Sarah's room. He hadn't opened that door in 3 years. Couldn't bear to see the space where she'd died, the bed where he'd held her as she slipped away. But tonight, with the memory of life instead of death fresh in his mind, he turned the key. The room was exactly as he'd left it, dusty, frozen in time, like a museum to grief. Sarah's hairbrush on the dresser, her shawl draped over the chair. The bed, made up with sheets that would never be slept in again. Colt stood in the doorway, waiting for the usual wave of pain. But it didn't come. Instead, he felt something else, something softer, sadder, but not quite as sharp. "I think I'm starting to let go," he whispered to the empty room. "I didn't mean to, but she's here now and—" He stopped. What was he saying? What was he admitting? "I don't know what I'm doing," he said finally, "but I think you'd like her. She's stubborn as hell. Wouldn't take no for an answer, kind of like you." The room offered no response, just dust motes floating in the moonlight. Colt stood there for a long moment, then quietly closed the door. He didn't lock it this time. Down the hall, Abigail heard the click of the door closing. She'd been awake, feeding Thomas, and the sound carried clearly through the quiet house. She'd watched Colt standing at that locked door for weeks now, always pausing, never entering. Tonight, he'd finally gone in, and when he came out, he'd left it unlocked. She held her baby close and allowed herself a small smile. Change came slowly to broken men, but it came. The next morning, word had spread through the entire county. By noon, 3 wagons had arrived at the ranch, neighbors and townspeople who'd heard about the miraculous cure. They came with sick children, ailing grandparents, mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't solve. They came with hope and desperation in equal measure. Colt found Abigail in the kitchen, surrounded by supplicants, examining a little girl's rash while simultaneously explaining to an old woman what herbs might help with her rheumatism. "I'm sorry," Abigail said when she saw him. "I tried to turn them away, but—" "It's all right," Colt said, surprising himself. "Help who you can. Just don't wear yourself out." So she did. Throughout that long day, Abigail dispensed remedies and advice, treating burns and coughs and mysterious aches. She never charged money, only asked for seeds, cuttings, or plants she didn't have in her garden. By sunset, the patch behind the barn had doubled in size, and Abigail had earned a new name among the local folks. The healer of Merriman Ranch, they called her. Colt wasn't sure how he felt about that. It drew attention, brought strangers to his property, disrupted the orderly routine he'd established. But it also brought something else: gratitude, respect, and a sense that his ranch was becoming more than just a place to raise cattle. It was becoming a home. That evening, after the last visitor had left and supper had been served, Colt found himself wandering toward the barn. He'd been doing that lately, walking the property after dark, checking things that didn't need checking, just to have something to do besides sit alone in his empty house. Tonight, he heard music. He followed the sound to the barn's loft, where he kept his guitar. He hadn't touched the instrument in 3 years, not since the day he'd buried Sarah. Music had felt like a betrayal somehow, like enjoying something meant forgetting her. But someone was playing it now. He climbed the ladder quietly and found Abigail sitting in the hay, his guitar cradled in her lap, picking out a simple melody. She wasn't particularly skilled, her fingers fumbled on some of the chords, but she was trying. "I'm sorry," she said when she noticed him. "I heard it up here and I couldn't resist. I'll put it back." "No," Colt said. "Keep playing." "I'm not very good." "Neither am I." He sat down in the hay across from her. "But I used to try." She resumed playing, and after a moment, Colt recognized the tune. An old hymn, one his mother used to sing. Abigail hummed along softly, and the notes drifted up through the barn rafters like smoke. "Why'd you stop?" she asked. "Stop what?" "Playing. There's dust on this guitar. It hasn't been touched in a long time." Colt looked at his hands, rough, scarred, better suited to work than music. "My wife died. Playing felt wrong after that." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Because she was gone and I was still here, and how could I make music when she couldn't hear it?" Abigail's fingers stilled on the strings. "My husband used to say that music was proof we were alive, that as long as we could make something beautiful, we hadn't given up." She looked at Colt, her eyes reflecting lantern light. "He died in a mining accident, cave-in. They found his body 3 days later, and the first thing I did when I got home was sing." "Why?" Because he couldn't anymore, and someone had to. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of loss and survival. "I'm sorry about your husband," Colt said finally. "I'm sorry about your wife." Abigail held out the guitar. "But I think she'd want you to keep playing. Dead doesn't mean forgotten, Mr. Merriman, and silence doesn't mean respect." Colt took the guitar, his hands remembering the shape of it, the way the wood felt against his palm. He strummed once, experimentally. The sound was rusty, uncertain. "It's out of tune," he said, "so fix it." He tuned it slowly, adjusting each string until the notes rang clear and true. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he began to play. The song came back to him like muscle memory, a ballad his father had taught him, about the prairie and the people who tried to tame it. Abigail closed her eyes and leaned back against a hay bale, listening. And for the first time in 3 years, Colt played music not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he was alive. And maybe that was enough. When the song ended, Abigail opened her eyes. That was beautiful. It was rough. It was alive. That makes it beautiful. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching dust motes dance in the lantern light. Then Abigail spoke again, her voice soft. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you really hire me? You didn't need a cook badly enough to take a risk on a woman with a baby. You could have managed somehow." Colt considered lying, giving her the practical answer about the men threatening mutiny and old Pete leaving. But something about this moment, the music, the darkness, the honesty in her question, demanded truth. "Because you reminded me of the women who built this place," he said. "The ones who came west with nothing but determination and skill and somehow made it work. My mother was like that. My wife was too." He paused. "And when you stood on my porch, exhausted and desperate but still fighting, I couldn't send you away. It would have been like sending away every strong woman who ever broke this land into something worth living on." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for seeing that. Thank you for being it." She stood, brushing hay from her dress. "I should get back. Thomas will be waking soon." "Abigail," Colt said. And she paused at the ladder. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "You're more than a cook. You know that, right? What you did today, saving Tommy, helping all those people, that's something rare." "It's just plants and patience, Mr. Merriman." "Call me Colt." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "That wouldn't be proper. Neither is climbing into a man's barn at night to play his guitar. I figure we're past proper." She smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "All right then, Colt." His name in her mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Softer, more human. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night." She descended the ladder and disappeared into the darkness. Colt sat alone in the loft, holding his guitar, feeling the ghost of music still vibrating in his chest. Something was changing. He'd felt it weeks ago, but now it was undeniable. The ranch was waking up, the garden growing, the men laughing, music returning to empty spaces. And at the center of it all was a woman who'd walked out of the prairie with nothing but a baby and a skill for making things grow. Colt looked at his guitar, then out through the barn window at the main house, where a light still burned in Abigail's room. "Damn," he whispered to the darkness, because he'd spent 3 years telling himself he was fine alone, that he didn't need anyone, that love was just another word for pain waiting to happen. But here, in the hay-scented darkness, holding a guitar he'd sworn he'd never play again, he had to admit the truth. He was starting to feel something. And for a man who'd spent 3 years feeling nothing at all, that was the most terrifying and wonderful thing in the world. The weeks that followed felt like watching ice melt in spring, slow, inevitable, and somehow miraculous. Colt found himself doing things he'd sworn he'd never do again. Playing guitar in the evenings, smiling at breakfast, checking on Abigail's garden, not because it needed checking, but because he wanted to see what new thing had pushed through the soil overnight. The men noticed. Wade mentioned it one morning while they were mending fence in the east pasture. "You're different, boss," Wade said, hammering a post into hard ground. "Different how?" "Lighter, like someone lifted a weight off your shoulders." Wade straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's good to see." Colt didn't know how to respond to that, so he just grunted and went back to work. But that night, standing in front of the mirror in his room, he studied his reflection and realized Wade was right. The lines around his eyes had softened. His jaw didn't clench quite as hard. He looked like a man who'd remembered how to live instead of just survive. And it scared the hell out of him, because caring about someone meant you could lose them. And Colt had lost enough for one lifetime. He tried to keep his distance, to maintain the boundary between employer and employee, but Abigail made it impossible. Not through any deliberate seduction. She remained professional, proper, focused on her work, but simply by being present in all the places where loneliness used to live. She sang while she cooked. She taught Billy how to identify healing plants. She sat on the porch in the evenings, nursing Thomas while the sun set, and the sight of her there, serene, maternal, utterly at peace, made Colt's chest ache with something he didn't want to name. One evening in late October, after a particularly good meal of roasted chicken and honey-glazed carrots, Colt found himself lingering in the kitchen doorway, watching Abigail clean up. "You need something?" she asked without turning around. "Just wondering where you learned to cook like that." "I told you. My mother. Your mother must have been remarkable." She was. Abigail scrubbed a pot with fierce concentration. She could make people feel loved just by feeding them. Said it was a kind of magic, turning flour and water into communion. "Is that what you're doing? Making us feel loved?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, defensive and almost accusatory. Abigail set down the pot and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm feeding you," she said quietly. "What you feel is up to you." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." They stared at each other across the kitchen, something unspoken crackling in the air between them. Then Thomas started crying from the other room, and the moment shattered. "Excuse me," Abigail said, drying her hands and brushing past him. Colt stood alone in the kitchen, listening to her soothe the baby, and wondered why he'd picked a fight when what he really wanted was to tell her thank you. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for making this place feel alive again. Thank you for making me remember I'm still human." But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind 3 years of practiced isolation. So instead, he walked outside into the cold October night and let the wind cut through him until he couldn't feel anything at all. The drought came like a thief in the night, gradual, insidious, unstoppable. November brought no rain. The grass, already sparse, turned brown and brittle. The creek that ran through the property slowed to a trickle, then dried up completely. Cattle that had been sleek and healthy started to thin out, their ribs showing through hide that had lost its shine. Other ranchers in the county were selling off their herds, cutting their losses before things got worse. But Colt had been through droughts before. He knew how to conserve, how to ration water, how to keep animals alive through sheer stubbornness and careful management. What he wasn't prepared for was watching them die anyway. It started with the calves, the youngest, weakest animals. They stopped eating, stopped moving, just stood with their heads down until they collapsed. Then it spread to the older cattle. One morning, Colt found 6 head dead in the north pasture, their bodies already bloating in the unseasonable heat. "Boss," Wade said, his voice grim, "this ain't natural. Drought doesn't kill cattle this fast." "Then what is it?" Wade shook his head. "Wish I knew." That night, Colt sat at his desk, going over the books. The numbers were brutal. Every dead cow was money lost, feed wasted, investment destroyed. If this kept up, he'd lose the ranch by spring. A knock at the door pulled him from his calculations. Abigail stood there, holding a cup of coffee and looking worried. "You missed supper," she said. "Wasn't hungry." "You need to eat." "I need to figure out what's killing my cattle." She set the coffee down and moved to the window, looking out at the dark prairie. "May I see one of the dead animals?" Colt frowned. "Why?" "Because I might be able to help." "You're a cook, not a veterinarian." "I'm also someone who knows plants and poisons." She turned to face him. "And I'm someone who's asking you to trust me. Again." The memory of Tommy Wilson, gray-faced and dying, flashed through Colt's mind. Abigail had saved him when no one else could. "All right," he said, standing. "But we go now. The coyotes will get to them by morning." They rode out together under a sky so clear and cold the stars looked like ice chips. Thomas was asleep back at the house, watched over by Billy Murphy, who'd volunteered without being asked. The prairie stretched around them, dead grass rustling in the wind like whispered warnings. When they reached the north pasture, Colt led Abigail to where the most recent deaths had occurred. The bodies were stiff now, eyes glazed, tongues swollen. In the moonlight, they looked almost peaceful. Abigail dismounted and approached the nearest carcass, her face set in concentration. She examined the mouth, the eyes, the distended belly. Then she walked the pasture, using Colt's lantern to study the ground, the remaining grass, everything the cattle might have eaten. After 20 minutes, she knelt beside a particular clump of weeds, touching the leaves with careful fingers. "Here," she said. Colt came to stand beside her. The plant looked unremarkable, small, scrubby, with narrow leaves and tiny white flowers. "That's spurgeweed," Colt said. "Same thing that poisoned Tommy, but cattle know to avoid it." "Most of the time, yes, but look at the rest of your pasture. There's almost nothing else to eat. The drought killed the good grass, and now this is all that's left." She pulled up a plant by the roots, showing him the extensive underground network. Spurgeweed has deep roots. It survives when other plants die. And desperate, hungry cattle will eat anything. Colt felt ice settle in his stomach. So they're poisoning themselves. Yes. And it's only going to get worse unless we do something. What can we do? I can't make it rain. I can't make good grass grow. Abigail stood still holding the spurgeweed, her dress fluttering in the cold wind. No, but I can make medicine. If we can't remove the poison from their environment, maybe we can help them survive it. That's impossible. There are hundreds of cattle spread across thousands of acres. So we start with the weakest ones, the ones most at risk. Her eyes glinted in the lantern light, fierce and determined. I won't promise miracles, Colt, but I can promise I'll try. And she did. For the next 2 weeks, Abigail worked like someone possessed. She transformed the kitchen into an apothecary, filling it with drying herbs, bubbling pots, and strange mixtures that smelled of earth and bitterness. She ground bark from the cottonwood trees near the dried-up creek, mixed it with ash from the fireplace and certain plants from her garden. The result was a thick gray paste that looked like mud and smelled worse. "The cattle won't eat that," Wade said doubtfully. "They will when you mix it with molasses," Abigail replied, already preparing the next batch. She was right. The sweet molasses disguised the bitter medicine, and the cattle, desperate and starving, ate it readily. But administering it was brutal work. Each animal had to be restrained, its mouth forced open, the paste fed by hand while it thrashed and fought. Colt and his men worked 16-hour days, rounding up cattle, treating them, moving on to the next group. Abigail was always there, directing operations, mixing more medicine, checking animals she'd treated days before to see if they were improving. She barely slept, barely ate. Her hands became covered in cuts and bruises from handling thrashing cattle. Her dresses grew stained with mud and worse. But she never complained, never slowed down. On the 5th day, Billy came running up with news that sent relief flooding through Colt's chest. "Boss, the cattle we treated first, they're looking better. The calves are eating again." It was true. The animals that had received Abigail's medicine were starting to recover, slowly but undeniably. They moved more, ate more, had brightness returning to their eyes. Word spread through the crew like wildfire. The healer had done it again. But the work wasn't finished. There were still hundreds of animals to treat, and Abigail was pushing herself too hard. Colt saw it in the tremor of her hands, the shadows under her eyes, the way she swayed on her feet between tasks. On the 7th day, he found her in the barn, mixing another batch of medicine, and noticed her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pestle. "Abigail," he said quietly. "Almost done with this batch," she murmured, not looking up. "Abigail, stop." "Can't stop. Too many cattle still—" "Stop." The command in his voice finally made her look up. Her eyes were glassy with exhaustion, her face pale despite the barn's warmth. "You're going to collapse," Colt said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't slept in 3 days." "How would you know?" "Because I haven't slept either. I've been watching you work yourself to death trying to save my ranch." He took the pestle from her trembling hands. "And I won't let you. Those animals they need you alive and functional, not dead from exhaustion." He guided her to a hay bale, making her sit. Wade and the boys can handle the treatments now. You've taught them how, but you need to rest. Thomas is fine. Billy's been watching him. That boy's probably a better mother than half the actual mothers in Texas. Colt knelt in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. Please, Abigail, rest. She stared at him for a long moment, and then something in her seemed to break. Her shoulders sagged. Her eyes filled with tears that she was too tired to hide. I can't lose this place, she whispered. I can't. It's the first home Thomas has ever known. The first place I felt safe since... She trailed off, but Colt understood. You won't lose it, he said, because you've already saved it. The cattle are recovering. The ranch will survive, but only if you survive too. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean path through the dust. Colt reached up without thinking and wiped it away with his thumb. Her skin was soft, warm, alive. They stayed like that, frozen in a moment of such tenderness it hurt. Until Abigail's eyes drifted closed and she swayed forward. Colt caught her before she fell, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all that strength packed into such a small frame. She didn't wake as he carried her back to the house, through the kitchen, into her room. He laid her on the bed and pulled a blanket over her. In the corner, Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle. Colt looked at them both, this woman and child who'd walked into his life uninvited and somehow become essential to it, and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd been so careful, so guarded. But somewhere between the cooking and the healing and the music, Abigail had slipped past his defenses and made him care again. And caring, as he'd learned, was the most dangerous thing in the world. But as he watched her sleep, exhausted from saving what he'd built, Colt realized he didn't care about the danger anymore. He was already lost. Abigail slept for 14 hours straight. When she finally woke, the sun was setting and her room was dim. She sat up groggily, momentarily disoriented, then saw Thomas beside her bed in his cradle, awake and content. And sitting in a chair by the door, keeping watch, was Colt. You stayed, she said, her voice rough with sleep. Someone had to make sure you didn't try to sneak back to work. The cattle are fine. Wade's been treating them. We've covered almost the entire herd. He stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. You did it, Abigail. You saved them. She closed her eyes, relief washing over her in waves. When she opened them again, Colt was standing closer, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything you've done. For this ranch, for my men, for me. You're welcome. I mean it. I don't know what I did to deserve you showing up on my doorstep, but you gave me a chance, Abigail interrupted, when I had nothing and no one. You took a risk on a desperate woman with a baby, and you treated us with dignity and respect. She held his gaze. That's what you did to deserve it. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unsaid. Colt took another step closer, and Abigail's breath caught. Abigail, huh? He said, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine. Colt, she whispered back. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek, calloused and warm. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two broken people who'd somehow started healing in each other's presence. Then Thomas made a noise, a small whimper that shattered the moment. Colt stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. You should eat something, he said, his voice gruff. I'll have one of the boys bring you a plate. Colt, wait. But he was already gone, retreating to whatever safe distance he needed to maintain. Abigail sat on her bed, touching her cheek where his hand had been, and wondered if she'd just imagined the whole thing. In the hallway, Colt leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. What the hell was he doing? Getting close to her, touching her, looking at her like she was something precious instead of just an employee? He was being a fool. She was half his age, with a baby and a past she barely talked about. She was here to cook and heal, not to fix whatever was broken inside him. But as he walked back to his office, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd whispered his name, soft and wondering, like it meant something, like he meant something. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. By the end of November, the crisis had passed. The cattle were recovering, the spurgeweed had been cleared from the main pastures, and the ranch had survived another trial. Colt's respect among his men had grown. Not just for weathering the storm, but for having the sense to hire Abigail Rose in the first place. "Best decision you ever made, boss," Sutton said one evening over supper. "That woman's worth her weight in gold." "Worth more than that," Wade added. "She's worth her weight in cattle at current market prices." The men laughed, and even Colt allowed himself a small smile. Across the mess hall, Abigail was serving seconds. Her energy finally returned, Thomas strapped to her back in that sling she'd made. She'd become a fixture on the ranch, as essential as water or air. The men called her Miss Abby with genuine affection. Travelers came from neighboring counties seeking her remedies. She'd even started teaching some of the hands about healing plants, creating a kind of informal school in the evenings. The ranch that had been dying was now thriving, transformed by the presence of one stubborn woman who refused to let anything stay broken if she could fix it. But not everyone was happy about it. The trouble arrived on a cold December evening, just as the first snow began to fall. 3 men rode up to the ranch house. City men, judging by their clean clothes and soft hands. They wore expensive hats and carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from money and power. Colt met them on the porch, already wary. "Help you, gentlemen?" he asked. The leader, a man with slicked back hair and a diamond stickpin in his tie, smiled without warmth. "We're looking for a woman named Abigail Rose. Heard she's working here." "What do you want with her?" "Business opportunity. We run an establishment in Amarillo, high-class place, good clientele. We've heard about her, talents, cooking, healing, that sort of thing." The man's smile widened. "We'd like to hire her. We can pay better than a cattle rancher, I guarantee that." Colt's jaw tightened. He knew what kind of establishment they meant. A saloon. Maybe worse. "She's not interested," Colt said flatly. "Maybe you should let her decide that." "I just did. Now get off my property." The man's expression hardened. "That's awful territorial, friend. We're just trying to make a business proposition. And I'm telling you no. Miss Rose has a good job here, and she's staying. End of discussion." "Everything all right?" Abigail had appeared in the doorway, holding Thomas, her face curious but wary. The 3 men looked at her with an intensity that made Colt's hands curl into fists. "These gentlemen were just leaving," Colt said. "We were hoping to talk to you, Miss Rose," the leader said, taking off his hat, "about an opportunity that might interest you. Good pay, comfortable lodgings, work that's a lot easier than cooking for a bunch of dirty cowboys." Abigail's expression went cold. "I'm happy where I am." "You haven't even heard our offer." "I don't need to. I know your type, and I know your offers. The answer is no." The man's smile vanished. "That's a shame. Woman like you could do real well in the city. Better than wasting yourself out here in the middle of nowhere." "I said no." "Think about it," the man pressed. "We'll be back in a few days. Maybe you'll have changed your mind." "She won't," Colt said, stepping forward. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, a clear message. "And if you come back, you'll be trespassing. I don't tolerate trespassers." The 3 men exchanged glances. Then the leader put his hat back on, tipped it mockingly toward Abigail, and climbed back on his horse. "Your funeral," he said to Colt. "Out here, accidents happen all the time. Men get careless, buildings catch fire. Shame when that happens." It wasn't subtle. It was a threat, clear as day. Wade and several other hands had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. They stood behind Colt, hands near their weapons, faces hard. The message was clear: you're outnumbered, and you're not welcome. The 3 men rode away slowly, taking their time, making sure everyone knew they weren't afraid. When they finally disappeared into the falling snow, Colt turned to find Abigail trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine, just—" She looked down at Thomas. "I've dealt with men like that before. They don't give up easy." "Then they'll learn the hard way." Colt looked at Wade. "Double the watch tonight. I want men patrolling the perimeter. Anyone approaches the house, I want to know about it." "Yes, sir." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Colt guided Abigail back inside. In the warmth of the kitchen, she finally let herself shake, holding Thomas close. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to bring trouble." "You didn't bring anything except help and healing. Those men brought trouble, and they'll regret it." "Colt, you can't—" "Can't what?" "Protect what's mine." The words came out before he could stop them. and they hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Abigail looked at him, her eyes wide. "I'm not yours. You work for me. You live under my roof. That makes you part of this ranch, and I protect what's mine." He softened his tone. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you or Thomas. That's a promise." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Something tells me those bastards meant what they said about coming back." He was right. They came 3 nights later, and they came with violence in mind. Colt woke to the sound of horses. Too many horses, moving too fast in the dead of night. He was out of bed before his eyes were fully open, pulling on his pants and grabbing his rifle in one smooth motion born from years of frontier living. Through his window, he saw shadows moving in the darkness, heard the low voices of men trying and failing to be quiet. He burst into the hallway just as Wade came running up the stairs, his face urgent in the dim lamplight. "Boss, we got trouble. 4 riders, maybe 5, coming in from the south. They torched the hay barn." Colt's blood went cold. "Get the men. And get Miss Rose and the baby into the root cellar, now." But when he reached Abigail's room, the door was open and the bed was empty. His heart seized with panic until he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Abigail's voice, low and steady, and Thomas crying. He found her dressed and holding the baby, her face pale but composed. Billy Murphy stood beside her, rifle in hand, looking terrified but determined. "They came for you," Colt said, and it wasn't a question. "I know." Abigail's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she held Thomas. "I heard them outside my window, heard one of them say my name. Billy, take her to the root cellar. Stay with her. Anyone comes near that door who isn't me or Wade, you shoot first and ask questions never. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Colt," Abigail started, but he cut her off. "Not now. Just stay safe, please." Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and something passed between them. All the things they hadn't said, all the feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. Then Billy was pulling her toward the cellar entrance, and Colt was running outside into chaos. The hay barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky like hungry fingers. The light from the fire illuminated the scene with hellish clarity. His men scrambling to contain the blaze, cattle panicking in their pens, and 3 riders circling the perimeter, hooting and firing pistols into the air. But Colt's mind was already working through the arithmetic of violence. 3 visible riders meant at least 2 more hidden somewhere. This wasn't about the barn. The fire was a distraction, meant to draw everyone's attention while someone else did the real work. Someone else went for Abigail. He spun around just in time to see a shadow detach from the side of the house, moving toward where he knew the root cellar entrance was hidden behind a false wall of stacked wood. Colt didn't shout a warning, didn't announce himself. He simply raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the ranch, louder than the fire, louder than the shouting. The shadow figure dropped, clutching his leg and screaming. Colt was on him in seconds, kicking away the man's pistol and pressing the rifle barrel against his throat. It was one of the city men from before, not the leader, but one of the others. Up close, he smelled of whiskey and desperation. "Where are the others?" Colt growled. "Go to hell," the man spat. Colt pressed the rifle harder, choking off air. "Wrong answer. Where are they?" A gunshot cracked from the direction of the barn, and Wade's voice rang out. "Got one, east side." Another shot, this one from Sutton. "Another down." The man beneath Colt's rifle suddenly looked less defiant and more afraid. "They were just supposed to scare you," he gasped. "Just scare you into letting her go." "By burning my barn and shooting up my ranch? Clayton, the boss, he don't take no for an answer. He always gets what he wants." "Not this time." Colt hauled the man up by his collar. "Wade, get some rope." The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos. Colt's men rounded up the attackers, 5 in total, including the wounded man Colt had caught. The leader, Clayton, was among them. His expensive clothes now torn and dirty, his face twisted with rage. "You made a big mistake, Merriman," Clayton snarled as Wade tied his hands. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have friends in Amarillo, powerful friends. They'll—" Colt hit him. Not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to shut him up. The man's head snapped back, blood trickling from his split lip. "Here's what's going to happen," Colt said, his voice cold as winter steel. "You and your men are going to sit in my barn, the one that's not on fire, until the sheriff arrives in the morning. Then you're going to tell him everything about tonight. The arson, the trespassing, the attempted kidnapping. And if you're real lucky, you'll only spend the next 10 years in prison instead of hanging." "Kidnapping?" Clayton laughed, spitting blood. "We weren't kidnapping anyone. We were making a business offer." "At 3 in the morning, with guns and fire?" Colt leaned in close. "I don't care how powerful your friends are. Out here, on my land, I'm the law, and I say you're done." He turned to Wade. "Lock them up. Post guards. Anyone tries to escape, shoot them in the leg. I'm tired of killing, but I'm willing to maim." "With pleasure, boss." As Wade and the others hauled the prisoners away, Colt finally allowed himself to breathe. The hay barn was still burning. They'd have to let it burn out, focus on keeping the fire from spreading. But his house was safe. His men were safe. And Abigail... He ran to the root cellar, his heart pounding. "Billy, it's me. It's over." The door opened slowly and Billy emerged first, rifle still raised, eyes wild with adrenaline. Then came Abigail, clutching Thomas to her chest, her face streaked with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed until now. "Are you hurt?" Colt asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, wanting to touch but afraid to. "We're fine. Billy protected us." Her voice shook. "But the barn, the fire, just a building, just hay. Everything that matters is still here." He finally gave in and touched her face, tilting it up to meet his eyes. "You're still here." She leaned into his hand for just a moment, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, they were full of anguish. "This is my fault," she whispered. "If I hadn't come here, none of this would have happened. Those men wouldn't have—" "Stop." Colt's voice was firm. "Those men made a choice, a stupid, violent choice. That's on them, not you. But they came because of me. They came because they're used to taking what they want. And they learned tonight that doesn't work here." He stroked her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache. "You didn't bring trouble, Abigail. You brought life. Those are two very different things." Thomas chose that moment to wail, exhausted and frightened by the chaos. Abigail shifted him to her shoulder, patting his back in that automatic way mothers did. "Let's get you both inside," Colt said. "It's going to be a long night, but it's over now." But even as he said it, he saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear that maybe she was a burden, a liability, more trouble than she was worth. And in that moment, Colt made a decision, one that terrified him but felt more right than anything had in 3 years. He was going to make her stay, not as an employee, not as a temporary solution to a problem, but as something permanent, something real. He just had to figure out how to tell her that without scaring her away. The sheriff arrived at dawn, a grizzled man named Carson who'd known Colt for 20 years. He took statements, examined the burned barn, and looked at the 5 prisoners with the expression of someone deeply tired of human stupidity. "These boys are going away for a long time," Carson said, sitting on Colt's porch with a cup of coffee. "Arson, attempted kidnapping, assault, that's enough to hang them, honestly. But I'll let a judge decide." "What about their boss?" Colt asked. Clayton mentioned powerful friends in Amarillo. Carson spat over the porch rail. "Clayton Murdoch, son of a banker, thinks money makes him untouchable. His daddy's tried to buy him out of trouble before, but this time he went too far." He looked at Colt seriously. "You did right standing your ground. Men like that, they need to learn the world doesn't revolve around their wants." "What about Miss Rose? Will she need to testify?" "Probably, but not for a while. Trial won't be for months, and honestly, with all your men as witnesses, her testimony's just icing on the cake." Carson finished his coffee and stood. "I'll take these idiots back to town. You focus on rebuilding that barn." After the sheriff left with his prisoners, the ranch settled into an exhausted quiet. The men who'd been up all night fighting the fire finally went to sleep. The cattle, spooked by the chaos, calmed down, and Colt found himself alone in the kitchen with Abigail, who was making breakfast like nothing had happened. But her hands shook as she cracked eggs into a bowl. "You should rest," Colt said. "I should cook. The men need to eat." "The men can wait. You need to stop pretending you're fine." She set down the bowl with more force than necessary. What do you want me to say, Colt? That I'm terrified? That every shadow makes me think someone's coming to take my son? That I lie awake at night wondering if I should just leave, go somewhere far away where trouble can't find me? Is that what you want? To leave? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Abigail's face crumpled, and for the first time since this all started, she let herself cry. No, she sobbed. That's the problem. I don't want to leave. This place, it's the first home I've had in years. The first place I've felt safe. The first place where I'm not just surviving, but actually living. She wiped her eyes angrily. And I'm terrified that I'm going to lose it. That I'm going to lose you. The last part came out as barely a whisper, but Colt heard it clearly. His heart, which had spent 3 years locked in ice, cracked wide open. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for half a second, then collapsed against his chest, crying into his shirt while he held her and Thomas both, his big hands gentle on her shaking shoulders. You're not losing anything, he murmured into her hair. You're not going anywhere. I won't let you. You can't promise that. Watch me. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. Abigail rose. You walked into my life carrying nothing but a baby and enough courage to shame most men I know. You saved my ranch twice, once with food, once with medicine. You brought music back into this house. You made my men remember what it feels like to be cared for. He cupped her face in his hands. And somewhere along the way, you made me remember what it feels like to be alive. Colt, I'm not finished. I know I'm twice your age. I know I'm broken in ways that might never fully heal. I know I've got no right to ask you for anything more than what you've already given. He took a shaky breath. But I'm asking anyway. Stay. Not as my cook. Not as my employee. Stay as... He couldn't finish the sentence. The words were too big, too terrifying. But Abigail understood. Her tears had stopped, and she was looking at him with an expression that made his breath catch. Wonder and hope and fear all mixed together. As what? She whispered. As mine, he said simply. As someone I get to protect and care for. As someone who belongs here, not because she has nowhere else to go, but because this is where she wants to be. And you? She asked. Where do you belong? Wherever you are. The words were out before he could stop them, raw and honest and more vulnerable than he'd been in years. Abigail's eyes widened, then filled with fresh tears, but these were different. These were happy. I'm scared, she admitted. Me too. I don't want to replace your wife. I could never... You're not replacing anyone. You're something entirely new. He stroked her cheek. Sarah was my past. She'll always be part of me. But you're my future, if you'll have me. Thomas, still between them, made a gurgling sound that could have been approval or protest. Abigail laughed through her tears, the sound watery but genuine. My son seems to think it's a good idea, she said. Smart boy. But Colt, this is crazy. We barely know each other. I've only been here a few months. I've known men for 20 years who I understand less than I understand you. Time isn't what matters. It's whether we're willing to try. She studied his face, and Colt let her look. Let her see all the scars and rough edges and broken places he usually kept hidden. Let her see the man beneath the cattle baron, the widower beneath the boss, the lonely soul beneath the hard exterior. Okay, she said finally. Okay? Okay, I'll stay. I'll try. She took a deep breath. I'll be yours, if you'll be mine. Colt smiled, really smiled. For the first time in so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like. Deal. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to kiss her more than he'd wanted anything in years. But Thomas was between them, and the moment felt too fragile, too new. So instead, he pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in her scent of rosemary and wood smoke, and something uniquely her. We'll figure this out, he murmured. One day at a time. One day at a time, she agreed. And for the first time since her husband had died in that mind collapse, Abigail let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth building a future on. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful and occasionally awkward as Colt and Abigail navigated their new relationship. They didn't announce anything to the men, didn't need to. The crew had eyes, and they saw the way Colt looked at Abigail now, the way he found excuses to be near her, the way she smiled when he entered a room. "About damn time," Wade said one evening, clapping Colt on the shoulder. "We were starting to think you were blind." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Boss, that woman's been looking at you like you hung the moon since about week 2. Rest of us were just waiting for you to catch up." Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he just grunted and went back to work. But that night, he found himself watching Abigail more carefully, looking for signs of what Wade had mentioned, and he saw it. The way her eyes followed him across the room, the way she blushed when he complimented her cooking, the way she found reasons to touch his arm, his hand, his shoulder in passing, small gestures that might mean nothing or might mean everything. It made him feel young and foolish and terrified and exhilarated all at once. One evening in late December, with Christmas approaching and the ranch slowly recovering from the fire, Colt finally worked up the courage to make his intentions clear. He'd spent the afternoon in town, supposedly buying supplies, but actually consulting with the local minister and jeweler. The ring he came back with was simple, a thin gold band with a single small diamond, but it was honest and solid, just like the woman he intended to give it to. He found her in her garden, even though it was nearly frozen solid. She was checking on the herbs, covering them with straw to protect them from the worst of the winter cold. "Those plants are tougher than you think," Colt said, announcing his presence. Abigail looked up and smiled. "So am I. But a little protection never hurt anyone." No, it didn't. He moved closer, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was 20 years old and courting Sarah. "Can we talk?" "Of course." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Is something wrong?" "No, the opposite, actually." He took a deep breath. "Abigail, I've been thinking about what I said after the fire. About you staying, about us trying." Her face fell slightly. "You've changed your mind." "No, God, no, the opposite." He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it out between them like an offering. "I want to make it permanent, legal. I want—" His voice cracked slightly. "I want you to marry me." Abigail stared at the ring, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "I know it's fast," Colt rushed on. "I know people will talk, but I don't care what people think. I care about you and Thomas. I care about waking up every day knowing you're here. I care about building something real, something lasting." He paused. "I love you. I don't know when it happened exactly, but somewhere between the first meal you cooked and the way you saved my cattle and the night you played my guitar in the barn, I fell in love with you. And I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know it." Tears streamed down Abigail's face, but she was smiling. "You love me? Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes. You're Colt Merriman. You're strong and successful and broken," he interrupted, "and lonely, and completely undone by a woman who walked 12 miles through the prairie heat, carrying a baby just to ask for a job." She laughed through her tears. "When you put it like that, so," he held the ring up higher, "will you marry me? Will you let me be Thomas's father? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" Abigail looked at him for a long moment, and Colt saw his entire future hanging in the balance. Then she stepped forward, took his face in her dirty, calloused hands, and kissed him. It was gentle and sweet, and tasted like tears and promises. When she pulled back, she was still crying, still smiling. "Yes," she whispered, "yes to everything." Colt slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, gleaming against her work-worn skin. Then he kissed her again, deeper this time, years of loneliness and grief melting away in the warmth of her acceptance. When they finally broke apart, the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and pink. Colt pulled Abigail close, tucking her under his arm, and together they stood in the garden she'd coaxed from dead ground. "We should tell the men," Abigail said eventually. "Tomorrow. Tonight. Let's just—" He trailed off, not sure how to explain what he felt. "Enjoy it," she suggested. "The quiet before everything changes?" "Yeah, that." They stood in comfortable silence until Thomas's cry echoed from the house, summoning his mother. Abigail laughed and pulled away reluctantly. "Duty calls. I'll come with you." and they walked back to the house together, engaged now, promised to each other, ready to face whatever came next. Inside, Billy was pacing with a fussy Thomas, looking relieved when Abigail appeared. "Thank God," the young cowboy said. "He's been crying for 10 minutes. I tried everything." "He's hungry," Abigail said, taking her son and settling into the rocking chair Colt had moved into the kitchen weeks ago. As she began nursing, Colt stood in the doorway, watching this domestic scene and feeling something settle in his chest. This was what he'd been missing. Not just a woman, not just a cook or healer, but a family. People to care for, people who cared back, people who made this big empty house feel like a home. Billy caught sight of the ring on Abigail's hand and his jaw dropped. Are you two? "We're getting married," Colt said simply. Billy whooped so loud that Thomas startled and began crying again. Sorry, but this is amazing. The boys are going to lose their minds." He was already heading for the door. "I got to tell Wade, he owes me $5. "You bet on this," Colt called after him. "Everyone bet on this. Sutton had Christmas, Wade had New Year's, I had December. I won." Billy disappeared into the night, still celebrating. Abigail laughed, soothing Thomas back to calmness. "Apparently we weren't as subtle as we thought." "Apparently not." Colt moved closer, kneeling beside the rocking chair. "Does that bother you?" "No, it's nice, actually, knowing they approve, knowing they—" She paused, searching for words. "Knowing they see us as something worth rooting for." "We are worth rooting for." He touched Thomas's tiny hand, marveling at how small and perfect it was. "All three of us." Thomas grabbed his finger and held on tight, and Colt felt his heart expand to accommodate this new love, not replacing what he'd felt for Sarah, but adding to it, building on it, proving that the human heart had infinite capacity for caring. Outside, they could hear Billy spreading the news, his excited voice carrying across the ranch. Soon there would be congratulations and celebration and probably some good-natured ribbing. But for now, in this quiet moment, it was just the three of them. A man who'd learned to hope again, a woman who'd found a place to belong, and a baby who'd never know how close he came to growing up without a father. "When do you want to do it?" Abigail asked. "The wedding?" "Tomorrow, if you'd have me," she laughed. "Let's give it at least a week. I'll need a dress that doesn't smell like cooking. You could wear a flour sack and you'd still be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "That's very sweet, but I'd still like a proper dress." She looked down at Thomas, then back up at Colt. "What about your wife, Sarah? Do you need more time?" It was a fair question, asked without jealousy or resentment. Colt considered it carefully. "I'll always love her," he said finally. "She was my first everything, first love, first wife, the one who helped me build this ranch. But she's gone, and I've spent 3 years being faithful to a ghost while the world kept turning without me." He met Abigail's eyes. "You didn't make me forget her. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive. There's a difference." "I'm glad," Abigail said softly, "because I don't want to erase your past. I just want to be part of your future." "You already are." And sitting there in the warm kitchen with the smell of bread baking and the sound of celebration starting outside, Colt finally understood what he'd been missing. Not just companionship or comfort or someone to cook his meals, but partnership, connection. The daily miracle of choosing to build a life with someone else, brick by brick, meal by meal, moment by moment. The cattle baron who'd lost everything had somehow found it all again. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. News of the engagement spread faster than prairie fire. By the next morning, the entire ranch knew, and by afternoon, word had reached town. Neighbors stopped by with congratulations and curiosity in equal measure. Some came bearing gifts, a hand-stitched quilt, preserves, a rocking horse carved from cottonwood for Thomas. Others came simply to see if the rumors were true, that the grieving widower Colt Merriman had finally found someone to fill the empty spaces in his life. Most offered genuine happiness. A few offered thinly veiled judgment. "Bit fast, isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Your poor Sarah's barely been gone 3 years." Abigail, who was serving coffee when this comment landed like a stone in still water, felt her face flush, But before she could respond, Colt's voice cut through the tension. 3 years is long enough to mourn, Mrs. Henderson, and I'd appreciate it if you'd respect my decision. His tone was polite but firm, the voice of a man who'd made peace with his choice. Abigail's made this ranch a home again. Made me remember what living feels like. That's not disrespecting Sarah's memory, it's honoring what she would have wanted for me. Mrs. Henderson had the grace to look embarrassed. She finished her coffee quickly and left, but not before Abigail caught her whispering to her companion about indecent haste and that woman with the baby. After they'd gone, Abigail sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. "Does it bother you?" Colt asked, sitting across from her. "What people say?" "I wish it didn't." She stared into her cup. "But I know what they're thinking, that I'm some opportunistic woman who trapped a wealthy rancher, that I used my cooking and my baby to manipulate you into—" "Stop." Colt reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't give a damn what they think. I know the truth. You didn't trap me. You saved me. There's a difference." "Is there?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "Because sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast. If maybe we should wait, give people time to— To what? To accept us? To give their blessing?" Colt squeezed her hand. "Abigail, I've spent 3 years doing what other people expected. Being the grieving widower, keeping Sarah's room locked, refusing to move on because that's what a devoted husband does." His voice grew passionate. "But you know what? Sarah's dead, and I'm not. And I refuse to spend whatever years I have left apologizing for choosing to be happy." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but she was smiling. "You're happy? Happier than I've been in years, aren't you?" She thought about it, really thought about it. 3 months ago, she'd been walking through the desert heat, desperate and alone, with nothing but a baby and a hope that somewhere, someone might give her a chance. Now she had a home, work she was good at, respect from the community, and a man who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm happy. Terrified, but happy." "Then that's all that matters." He stood, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her forehead. "Let them talk. We know the truth." But the talk didn't stop. If anything, it grew worse as the wedding date approached. Colt had wanted something simple, just a ceremony at the ranch with the minister and his men as witnesses. But Abigail insisted on doing it properly, in the small church in town, with an invitation extended to anyone who wanted to come. "I won't hide," she said firmly. "I won't act like we're ashamed of what we're doing. If we're going to do this, we do it in front of God and everyone, and we hold our heads high." Colt had never loved her more than in that moment. The week before the wedding, Wade took Colt aside with a concerned expression. "Boss, you should know. There's been talk in town about Miss Abby." Colt's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The ugly kind. Some folks saying she bewitched you with her herbs and potions. Others saying she's after your money. One old biddy even claimed Thomas isn't really her dead husband's baby, that she was already pregnant when she showed up here." Rage flooded through Colt, hot and immediate. "Who said that?" "Does it matter? It's horseshit and everyone with sense knows it." Wade shifted uncomfortably. "But I thought you should be prepared, in case someone says something at the wedding." "They won't." Colt's voice was hard as iron. "Because if anyone insults my wife-to-be, they'll answer to me. Spread that word, Wade. Make sure everyone knows." "Yes, sir." That night, Colt told Abigail about the rumors. He watched her face carefully, expecting tears or anger. Instead, she just looked tired. "I knew this would happen," she said quietly. "People always fear what they don't understand. A woman who knows herbs, who can heal, that's witchcraft to them. Never mind that I learned it from my mother, who learned it from her mother. Never mind that everything I do has roots in common sense and observation." "You're not a witch?" "No, but I'm also not sorry for what I know." She met his eyes. "I won't stop healing people, Colt. Even after we're married. I can't. It's part of who I am." "I know, and I wouldn't ask you to stop." He pulled her close. "But I will ask you to be careful. Not everyone appreciates help, and some people are dangerous when they're afraid. I'll be careful." She rested her head against his chest. "But I won't hide." Wouldn't expect you to. 3 days before the wedding, disaster struck again, though this time it came from nature rather than men. Colt was in the barn when he heard the commotion. He ran outside to find several hands gathered around something on the ground. As he pushed through, his stomach dropped. It was one of his best breeding mares, collapsed and breathing in labored gasps. Her sides were distended, sweat coating her flanks. She was in foal, but something had gone wrong. "How long has she been like this?" Colt demanded. "Found her about 10 minutes ago," Sutton said. "She was fine this morning. Now—" He shook his head grimly. Colt knelt beside the mare, running his hands over her swollen belly. He'd seen difficult births before, knew the signs of a breech or a foal too big to be born naturally. This was bad. Without help, both mother and baby would die. "Get Doc Randall," he ordered. "Boss, he's in Amarillo treating some banker's wife. Won't be back for 3 days. 3 days. The wedding was in 3 days. And this mare would be dead in 3 hours without intervention. "Then get Miss Rose," Colt said. "She's a people doctor, not a horse doctor," someone protested. "She understands birth and bodies and medicine better than any of us. Get her. Now." 5 minutes later, Abigail arrived, Thomas strapped to her back, her face serious as she assessed the situation. She circled the mare slowly, watching her breathing, the way she tried and failed to stand, the panic in her rolling eyes. "The foal's stuck," Abigail said finally. "Probably turned wrong. Can't be born the way it is." "Can you fix it?" Colt asked. "I can try." She looked at him seriously. "But I've only done this twice, and one didn't survive. I'm not a veterinarian, Colt. I might make things worse. Or you might save them both. That's better odds than they've got right now." She nodded once, then started issuing orders with the same authority she'd shown when treating Tommy Wilson. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and soap. Someone take Thomas, and I need space. Everyone but Colt and one other man. Back up." Wade volunteered to stay. The others retreated but didn't leave, forming a concerned circle at a distance. Abigail washed her hands and arms thoroughly, then knelt beside the mare's hindquarters. "Hold her head," she told Colt. "Keep her calm. This is going to hurt." Colt positioned himself at the mare's head, stroking her neck, murmuring the nonsense words that sometimes soothed frightened animals. He watched Abigail work, her face set in concentration, her hands moving with careful confidence despite her claimed lack of experience. She reached inside the mare, her face contorting with effort, feeling for the foal that was trapped. The mare screamed, a horrible, human-like sound, and tried to kick. Wade held her back legs while Colt kept her head down. "I've got it," Abigail gasped. "One leg folded wrong. If I can just—" She worked for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sweat poured down her face. The mare thrashed weakly, exhausted from labor and pain. Colt kept talking, kept stroking, kept praying to whatever God might be listening. Then Abigail's face changed. "There, it's turned. Now we just need—" The mare gave one last massive push, and suddenly the foal was sliding out in a rush of fluid and membrane. It lay still on the straw, not breathing, its coat dark and wet. "No," Abigail whispered. She moved immediately to the foal, clearing its nose and mouth, rubbing its chest vigorously. "Come on, baby. Breathe. Come on." Nothing. The foal lay limp and lifeless. Around them, the watching men removed their hats, assuming the worst. Even Wade looked away, unable to watch. But Abigail didn't give up. She positioned the foal on its side and pressed on its chest in a rhythm Colt recognized from when she'd revived a drowning child last month, forcing air in and out, refusing to accept defeat. "Abigail said," Colt said gently, "it's gone." "Not yet it isn't." Her voice was fierce. She kept working, kept pressing, kept trying. And then, a miracle. The foal gasped. Its legs twitched. It gasped again, stronger this time, and suddenly it was breathing on its own, sides heaving with effort. A cheer went up from the watching men. The mare, still exhausted but alive, lifted her head to look at her baby. Abigail sat back on her heels, covered in birth fluids and sweat, her face streaked with tears of relief. "You did it," Colt breathed. "We did it." She looked up at him, smiling through her exhaustion. "All of us." The foal struggled to its feet on shaky legs, and the mare reached over to nuzzle it, making soft sounds of encouragement. Within minutes, the baby was nursing, and the mare was already looking better, her breathing evening out. "That's a good omen," Billy said, watching the scene with wonder. "New life just before a wedding." "That's not an omen. That's Miss Abby being brilliant," Wade corrected. "Again." The men crowded around, clapping Abigail on the back, thanking her, marveling at what she'd done. But Colt noticed she was shaking, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "All right, give her space," he ordered. "Wade, take over here. Make sure they're both stable. The rest of you, back to work." He guided Abigail away from the barn, toward the house. She walked unsteadily, her legs weak from kneeling so long in one position. "I thought it was dead," she said quietly. "For a moment I really thought we'd lost it. But we didn't, because you refused to give up. I couldn't, not when there was even a chance." She looked at him with fierce intensity. "That's how I feel about everything here, about this ranch, about us, even when it seems impossible, even when everyone says it won't work. I have to try. I have to believe there's a chance." Colt pulled her close, heedless of the mess covering her dress. "And I love you for it. For being the kind of person who fights for things, who doesn't accept defeat, who saves dying foals and broken men with equal determination." She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "The foal was easier. You were much more stubborn. I prefer to think of it as resistant to change. That's just stubborn with better vocabulary." He kissed her then, there in the middle of the ranch yard, in front of God and anyone who cared to look. She kissed him back, tasting of salt and effort and hope. When they broke apart, Billy was watching from the barn door, holding Thomas and grinning like a fool. "Get a room," he called. "We will," Colt called back. "In 3 days, officially." More laughter rippled through the ranch. The tension from the difficult birth dissolved into celebration, and Colt realized this was what community felt like. Not just people working together, but people caring together, supporting each other through crisis and triumph alike. This was what Abigail had built here, without even trying. Not just a functioning ranch, but a family. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the prairie grass like diamond dust. Abigail woke early, her stomach churning with nerves. She'd barely slept, kept awake by Thomas's fussing and her own racing thoughts. What if she was making a mistake? What if Colt woke up one day and realized he'd married beneath him? What if the gossips were right, and this was all moving too fast? But then she remembered the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and irreplaceable. The way he'd defended her to the neighbors. The way he'd held her after the foal's birth, like she was the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen. A man didn't fake that kind of devotion. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Wade's wife, Mary, who'd arrived yesterday from their homestead to help Abigail prepare. "You ready to become Mrs. Merriman?" Mary asked, carrying a wrapped bundle. "I don't know. Ask me again in 4 hours." Mary laughed and unwrapped the bundle, revealing a dress in cream-colored silk. "This was my mother's wedding dress. I wore it when I married Wade, and I thought, if you don't have something—" Abigail touched the fabric reverently. It was beautiful, simple but elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "I couldn't." "You can, and you will. Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day." Mary's eyes were kind. "Besides, it's good luck. My mother was married for 47 years. I've been married for 20. Maybe it'll bring you the same fortune." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have to get you into it and fix your hair. Thomas, you be good for Auntie Mary while your mama gets beautiful, all right?" The next 3 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Mary worked miracles with Abigail's hair, braiding it into an elegant crown and weaving in small wildflowers that Billy had picked that morning. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Mary even produced a string of pearls, borrowed from the general store owner's wife. She insisted you have something nice, that Abigail fastened around her neck with shaking hands. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The exhausted woman who'd walked 12 miles through the prairie heat had transformed into someone radiant, someone worthy of standing beside a man like Colt Merriman. "He's not going to know what hit him," Mary said, smiling. At the church, Colt was having his own crisis of confidence. He stood in the small room off the sanctuary, tugging at his collar, while Wade and Sutton tried to calm him down. "What if she changes her mind?" Colt said. "What if she gets to the church and realizes this is insane?" "Then she's smarter than we thought," Sutton deadpanned. "Not helping," Wade said. He turned to Colt. "Boss, that woman walked through the desert to get here. She fought off kidnappers. She saved your cattle from poisoning and your mare from dying. You think she's going to get cold feet over a wedding? People do. Not people like her. She's tougher than both of us combined." Wade straightened Colt's tie. "Now stop fidgeting and go get married. Some of us have money riding on this actually happening." "You bet on my wedding. Everyone bet on your wedding. Billy's got 2-to-1 odds you cry during the ceremony." "I'm not going to cry." "We'll see." The church was packed. Every ranch hand who could be spared was there, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. Neighbors filled the pews, some genuinely happy, others clearly there to satisfy their curiosity. Even Sheriff Carson had showed up, tipping his hat to Colt as he took a seat near the back. Colt stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. The minister, a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, gave him an encouraging smile. "Breathe, son. She'll be here." Then the doors opened and Abigail appeared. Colt forgot how to breathe entirely. She was radiant, walking slowly down the aisle with Thomas in her arms, wearing a dress that made her look like something from a dream. But it wasn't the dress that stopped Colt's heart. It was her smile. Nervous but determined, scared but brave, looking at him like he was her destination, her home, her future. Billy, acting as her escort since she had no father to give her away, walked beside her with visible pride. When they reached the altar, Billy carefully transferred Thomas into Mary's arms, then stepped back. Abigail took Colt's offered hand, and suddenly the world narrowed to just the two of them. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "You look terrified," she whispered back. "That too." Reverend Thomas cleared his throat and began the ceremony. The words washed over Colt in a haze of emotion, something about love and commitment and building a life together. He said, "I do," when prompted, his voice steady despite the storm of feeling inside him. Then it was Abigail's turn. "Do you," Abigail rose, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Abigail looked at Colt, and in her eyes, he saw every moment that had brought them here. The day she'd arrived desperate and determined, the night she'd saved Tommy Wilson, the hours spent treating poisoned cattle, the moment in the barn when music had returned to his life, the proposal in her garden, the foal they'd saved together just 3 days ago. "I do," she said, and her voice rang clear and certain through the church. Reverend Thomas smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Colt had kissed Abigail before, quick, stolen moments of affection. But this kiss was different. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a declaration to everyone watching that she was his and he was hers, now and forever. When they finally broke apart, cheers erupted through the church. Hats flew in the air. Someone, probably Billy, was whooping like a madman. And Colt, looking at his new wife's tear-stained, joy-filled face, felt something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Complete. The celebration afterward was simple but heartfelt. The ranch hands had set up tables outside the church, covered with food that various neighbors had contributed. There was music, Colt playing his guitar while others joined in with fiddles and harmonicas. Children ran between the tables, laughing and playing. Thomas was passed from person to person, cooed over and spoiled by every woman in attendance. Abigail stood beside Colt, her hand in his, watching the celebration unfold with wonder. "Is this real?" she murmured. "If it's not, don't wake me up. Wake me." She laughed and leaned into him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. For taking a chance on me. For making me believe that maybe I deserve something good after all the bad." Colt turned to face her fully, framing her face with his hands. "Abigail Merriman, God, I love saying that. You deserve every good thing this world has to offer. and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to give them to you. Just don't burn down any more barns in the process. No promises." They were interrupted by Wade tapping a glass for attention. The crowd quieted, turning to look. "I just want to say a few words about the boss and his new bride," Wade began. 6 months ago, this ranch was dying. The men were miserable. The boss was existing, not living. Then this woman showed up, walked right out of the prairie like she'd been sent by Providence itself, and everything changed. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. She fed us. She healed us. She reminded us what it felt like to be cared for instead of just managed. And she did something even more miraculous. She brought our boss back to life. Wade raised his glass. "So here's to Abigail Rose Merriman, the best cook, the best healer, and now the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. May your marriage be long, your pantry always full, and your garden forever green." "To Abigail," the crowd chorused, drinking deep. Abigail's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. She raised her own glass in acknowledgement, then turned to Colt. "Your turn," she said. "I'm not good with words." "Try anyway." Colt cleared his throat, suddenly nervous despite being surrounded by people he'd known for years. I'm not good at speeches, but I want to say something about Abigail and about what she's meant to me." The crowd settled, listening intently. 3 years ago, I buried my wife, and I thought that was it, that I'd had my shot at happiness and lost it. I locked myself away, did my duty, kept the ranch running, but I was just going through the motions. Then this woman showed up, asking for a job, and I almost sent her away. Almost told her no because I was too scared to let anything new into my life. He looked at Abigail, who was watching him with such love it made his chest ache. But she didn't give me a choice. She walked into my kitchen and started cooking, started healing, started making this place feel like a home instead of a tomb. She taught me that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you can't love someone who's here, that starting over isn't betraying the past. It's honoring it by choosing to keep living. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to collect himself. Several people in the crowd were crying now, including Wade. "So thank you, Abigail, for being stubborn enough to insist on staying, for being brave enough to love a broken man, and for reminding me that as long as we're alive, there's always a chance to start again." He raised his glass. "To second chances, and to the woman who gave me mine." The crowd erupted in cheers again, and Billy collected his winnings from Wade with a triumphant grin. Colt had indeed cried, though just barely. As the celebration continued into the evening, Colt found himself standing apart from the crowd for a moment, watching everything unfold. His ranch, his men, his wife, his new family. 6 months ago, he'd been alone and hollow, going through the motions of life without really living it. Now he was surrounded by love and light and laughter, married to a woman who'd walked out of the desert and straight into his heart. "You all right?" Abigail asked, appearing beside him with Thomas drowsy in her arms. "Better than all right." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Me too." They stood like that, watching the celebration, until Thomas started fussing for his evening feeding. Abigail excused herself to a quiet corner while Colt made the rounds, thanking everyone for coming, accepting congratulations and well wishes. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the crowd started to thin. People headed home, back to their own ranches and lives, leaving behind promises to visit soon and invitations to return the favor. Finally, it was just Colt and Abigail and Thomas, standing in the ranch yard as the last wagon disappeared into the distance. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Merriman?" Colt asked. "I am home," Abigail replied. And she was right. The ranch house, once echoing and empty, now held 3 people who'd found in each other what they'd been missing. The kitchen that had been a place of drudgery was now the heart of the home. The locked bedroom had been opened and aired out, its ghosts finally laid to rest. The barn, where Colt had once played music to nothing but memories, now rang with genuine joy. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, Colt and Abigail sat on the porch together, wrapped in a shared blanket against the December cold. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The sign," Colt said. "What sign?" "For the ranch. I've been thinking about changing it, adding your name, Merriman and Rose Ranch. Abigail smiled. I like that. Though technically it's just Merriman now. You'll always be Rose to me, the woman who grew hope in dead ground. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I want to expand the garden in the spring, maybe start teaching more people about healing herbs. Turn it into something bigger, a place where people can come to learn, not just to get treatment when they're desperate. I think that's a wonderful idea. And I want to adopt Thomas, legally. Give him your name, make it official that he's ours. He already is ours, has been since the day you arrived. Colt kissed the top of her head. But yes, we'll make it legal. Thomas Merriman has a nice ring to it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Cattle lowed softly in their pens. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the promise of spring. Colt, Abigail said eventually. Yeah? Thank you for not giving up on me, on us. Thank you for not letting me. And there, on the porch of a ranch that had nearly died but was now thriving, two people who'd been broken found wholeness in each other. A cattle baron who'd forgotten how to live learned to hope again. A single mother who'd walked through the desert found a home worth fighting for. The sign went up 2 weeks later, carved by one of the hands who had a talent for woodwork. It hung proudly above the main gate, visible to anyone approaching from the road. Merriman and Rose Ranch, where spring came back to Texas. And beneath it, in smaller letters, a promise. All are welcome. Because that's what Abigail had taught them all. That a home wasn't just a building or a piece of land, but a place where broken things could be mended, where lost souls could find belonging, and where love, given a chance, could grow even in the hardest ground. The drought would come again. It always did in Texas. There would be more cattle to save, more illnesses to treat, more challenges to face. But they would face them together, this unexpected family built from desperation and hope. And on cold December nights, when Colt played his guitar and Abigail sang while Thomas slept peacefully nearby, they would remember how it all started. With a simple job posting, with a woman brave enough to walk 12 miles for a chance, with a man broken enough to let her try, with two people who'd lost everything finding in each other something worth building a future on. The Texas Panhandle didn't forgive weakness, but it rewarded courage. And in the end, that's what saved them both. Not perfection, not luck, but the simple courage to keep trying when it would have been easier to give up. To choose hope over despair. To choose life over mere survival. To choose love, even when, especially when, it seemed impossible. And they lived, not happily ever after in the fairy tale sense, but happily enough in the real way that mattered, with hard work and soft moments, with challenges overcome and dreams realized, with a garden that grew greener every year and a home that never stopped feeling full. Years later, when Thomas was grown and running the ranch himself, people would still talk about the legend of Abigail Rose, the woman who walked out of the desert and brought spring back to Texas. Some would say she was a witch. Others would call her a saint. But those who knew her best would simply say she was human, beautifully and imperfectly human, who loved hard and worked harder, and never stopped believing that broken things could be made whole. And Colt, who lived to see his 80th year with Abigail by his side the entire time, would tell anyone who asked that hiring a cook was the best business decision he ever made. Though really, he'd say with a wink, she'd hired him. All he'd done was be smart enough to say yes. 5 years passed like seasons through skilled hands, sometimes slow, sometimes swift, but always moving forward. The ranch that Abigail and Colt had saved together flourished in ways neither could have imagined that first desperate night when she'd cooked to prove her worth. The garden behind the barn had grown from a small patch of defiant herbs into something remarkable. 3 acres now, carefully tended and expertly organized, with sections for medicinal plants, culinary herbs, vegetables that fed the ranch hands, and even a small orchard of fruit trees that Abigail had coaxed into thriving against all odds. She'd built a small greenhouse with Colt's help, allowing her to grow delicate plants year-round, and the whole operation had become something of a legend in the county. People came from as far as Amarillo now, seeking Abigail's remedies and knowledge. She'd started holding classes twice a month, teaching women and a few brave men about healing herbs, proper nutrition, and the art of keeping a family healthy without always relying on expensive doctors. She never charged for these lessons, asking only that her students pass the knowledge forward. My mother always said that hoarding knowledge is the worst kind of poverty, she'd explained to Colt one evening. The more people who know how to heal, the fewer people suffer unnecessarily. The ranch itself had doubled in size. With the money saved from Abigail's remedies, which cost pennies compared to doctors' bills, and the increased productivity of well-fed, healthy workers, Colt had been able to purchase the neighboring property when Old Man Hutchins retired. They now ran over 1,000 head of cattle across 12,000 acres, with a crew of 35 men who were fiercely loyal to both Merriman and Rose. But it was the changes inside the house that mattered most. Sarah's old bedroom had been transformed into a nursery, though not for Thomas alone. 2 more children had joined the family. First, a daughter they'd named Sarah Rose, honoring both the past and the present. She was 3 now, with her mother's determination and her father's steady gaze, and she followed Abigail everywhere, learning about plants before she could properly pronounce their names. Then came another son, James, barely a year old, who had Colt's dark hair and a temperament so easygoing that Abigail often joked he must have been switched at birth. Thomas, now 5.5, had no memory of the desperate walk through the desert or the tiny room off the kitchen where he'd spent his first months. As far as he was concerned, Colt had always been his father, this ranch had always been his home, and the sprawling family of ranch hands had always been his extended family. He followed Wade around like a shadow, learning to rope and ride, already showing the kind of natural horsemanship that made Colt's chest swell with pride. "He's going to be better than both of us," Colt said one morning, watching Thomas successfully rope a fence post on his 3rd try. "He's got a good teacher," Abigail replied, leaning against her husband. Even after 5 years, the simple comfort of standing beside him still made her heart flutter. "You've given him something my first husband never could have. Stability. A future. We gave him that, you and me together." It was true. Everything they'd built had been built together, not just the garden or the ranch's prosperity, but a life that felt solid and real and worth protecting. Not that everything had been easy. There had been hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle, and financial close calls. There had been the time little Sarah had fallen from the barn loft and broken her arm, sending both parents into panic until Abigail's steady hands set the bone and Colt's gentle words calmed their screaming daughter. There had been the influenza outbreak that swept through the county, killing a dozen people before Abigail's elderberry syrup and careful nursing helped the ranch emerge relatively unscathed. And there had been the ghosts, the inevitable comparisons to Sarah, the whispers that never quite died away, the moments when Colt would grow distant and Abigail would wonder if she'd ever truly replace what he'd lost. But they'd learned to talk through those moments instead of letting them fester. Learned that loving someone new didn't erase the old love, but added to it, layered it, created something richer and more complex than either love alone could have been. "Sometimes I talk to her," Colt admitted one night, after the children were asleep and they sat together in their bedroom. "To Sarah, I mean. In my head. Telling her about you, about the kids, about how the ranch is doing." "What do you think she says back?" Abigail asked, not threatened but genuinely curious. "I think she's relieved. That I didn't waste the rest of my life grieving. That I found someone who could love this place and these people the way she did." He pulled Abigail closer. "That I found you." "I hope so," Abigail said softly, "because I like to think she'd approve. Of us. Of how we're raising the children. Of what we've built here. She would. I'm certain of it." The biggest change came in the spring of their 5th year together, when Abigail received a letter that arrived with the weekly mail delivery. Wade brought it to her in the garden, where she was transplanting seedlings with Sarah's help, which mostly consisted of the little girl making mud pies nearby. "This came for you, Miss Abby," Wade said, using the title he'd never quite dropped despite her married status. "Fancy envelope. From Austin." Abigail wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter, frowning at the official seal. When she opened it and read the contents, her eyes went wide. "What is it?" Wade asked, concerned by her expression. "It's from the state medical board," she said, her voice stunned. "They want me to come to Austin, to speak at a conference about frontier medicine and the use of traditional healing methods. That's wonderful. It's terrifying. She read the letter again, as if the words might change. They want me to present my methods, my garden, everything I do here, in front of actual doctors. And you will, came Colt's voice. He'd approached unheard, drawn by the commotion. Because what you do works, and it's time more people knew about it. But I'm not a real doctor. I don't have formal training or certificates, or you have something better. You have results. Colt took the letter, reading it himself. Abigail, how many people have you treated in the last 5 years? Hundreds? Thousands? I don't keep count. Well, I do. Or at least, I notice when people stop dying from things that should kill them. When children survive scarlet fever because you knew which herbs to use. When women survive childbirth because you were there with your knowledge and your steady hands. He handed the letter back. You're going to Austin, and I'm going with you. What about the ranch? The children? Wade can manage the ranch for a week. Mary would love to watch the children. You know she would. And this is important, Abigail, not just for you, but for every person who could benefit from this knowledge spreading. She looked down at the letter, then at the garden she'd built from nothing, then at her daughter playing in the mud, oblivious to the weight of the moment. All right, she said finally. I'll go. We'll go. Together. Colt smiled and kissed her forehead. Together. Always. The trip to Austin was Abigail's first time leaving the ranch in 5 years, and her first time ever seeing the state capitol. The city overwhelmed her with its size and noise and crowds, so different from the vast quiet of the prairie. But Colt stayed close, his solid presence anchoring her when she felt adrift. The medical conference was held in a grand hotel, with doctors from across Texas and even a few from back east. Abigail felt distinctly out of place in her simple dress, the fanciest she owned but still country-made, surrounded by men in expensive suits carrying leather bags full of instruments she'd never seen. Maybe this was a mistake, she whispered to Colt as they entered the main hall. Not a mistake. Destiny. He squeezed her hand. Show them what frontier medicine really looks like. Her presentation was scheduled for the second day. She'd brought samples of her most effective remedies, carefully labeled, along with detailed notes on preparation and dosage. She'd also brought photographs that Billy had taken of her garden, showing the scale and organization of her operation. When her name was called, Abigail walked to the podium on shaking legs. The audience, at least 50 doctors, all men except for 2 stern-faced women in the back row, watched her with expressions ranging from polite interest to undisguised skepticism. Gentlemen, ladies, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. My name is Abigail Merriman. I'm not a doctor. I have no formal medical training. What I have is knowledge passed down through generations of women, refined through trial and error, and proven through 5 years of practice on a working cattle ranch. She proceeded to detail her methods, the herbs she used for fever, inflammation, infection, pain, the dietary recommendations that kept men healthy even in harsh conditions, the preventative measures that had kept illness from spreading through the ranch during multiple outbreaks. She spoke plainly, without medical jargon, but with a precision that came from intimate knowledge of her craft. The questions came fast and harsh. How do you ensure proper dosage without medical instruments? Experience and observation. I start small and adjust based on the patient's response. What's your success rate? In 5 years, I've lost 3 patients. All were already near death when they came to me. The infection or injury was too advanced for any intervention. A murmur went through the crowd. 3 deaths in 5 years was remarkably low, even by modern medical standards. You claim elderberry prevents influenza, one doctor challenged. That's superstition, not medicine. I can only tell you what I've observed, Abigail replied calmly. Every person on our ranch who took elderberry syrup daily during last year's outbreak remained healthy. In the neighboring ranches that didn't use it, 12 people died. Draw your own conclusions. Correlation isn't causation, another doctor interjected. Perhaps not. But when people are dying, I'd rather use something that seems to work than stand on principle while doing nothing. That silenced several critics. Because she was right, frontier life didn't allow for the luxury of perfect scientific method. You used what worked, or people died. One of the women in the back row stood up. Mrs. Merriman, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hayes from Houston. I'd like to know more about your prenatal care methods. I understand you've attended several births with zero maternal mortality. That's correct. 8 births in 5 years, all successful. Remarkable. What's your secret? Cleanliness, mostly, and not intervening unless absolutely necessary. I let women's bodies do what they're designed to do, and I only step in when something goes wrong. Abigail's voice grew passionate. Too many doctors treat childbirth like a disease that needs curing instead of a natural process that needs supporting. Dr. Hayes smiled. I couldn't agree more. Would you be willing to share your detailed methods? I'd love to implement them in my own practice. Of course. That's why I'm here. The tide began to turn. More questions came, but they were curious now rather than hostile. Doctors asked for her recipes, her growing methods, her diagnostic techniques. Several admitted they'd lost patients to conditions Abigail routinely cured. By the end of her presentation, she had a crowd of doctors surrounding her, all wanting to know more. Dr. Hayes insisted on visiting the ranch to see the operation firsthand. A doctor from San Antonio wanted to feature her methods in a medical journal. The president of the state medical board, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, pulled her aside personally. Mrs. Merriman, he said, what you're doing is important, more important than you might realize. There's a growing movement in medicine toward understanding traditional remedies, toward bridging the gap between folk knowledge and formal practice. You're at the forefront of that movement. I'm just trying to help people, Abigail said. Exactly, and that's what medicine should be, helping people, not gatekeeping knowledge. He handed her his card. Stay in touch. I have a feeling we'll be working together in the future. That evening, back in their hotel room, Colt found Abigail sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights, looking dazed. You all right? He asked. I don't know. I feel like I stepped into some other woman's life today, like that couldn't have been me up there, talking to all those important doctors. It was you. You were magnificent. He sat beside her, taking her hand. You know what you did today? You gave legitimacy to the knowledge your mother passed down. You proved that being poor or uneducated doesn't mean being ignorant. You showed that there is value in women's wisdom, in practical experience, in paying attention to what actually works instead of just what the textbooks say. It felt right, she admitted. Scary, but right, like I was supposed to be there. You were. And this is just the beginning, I think. Your garden, your methods, they're going to spread far beyond our ranch now. She leaned against him, processing everything that had happened. Thank you for believing in me, for pushing me to do this even when I was terrified. Thank you for being worth believing in. They returned to the ranch a week later to chaos, the good kind. Mary had managed the household admirably, but 3 children under 6 had tested even her considerable patience. Thomas had somehow gotten stuck in a tree. Sarah had decided to help in the kitchen and created a flower explosion that still dusted every surface. And James had developed a new tooth, making him cranky and sleepless. But it was home. Messy, loud, imperfect home. Mama! Sarah shrieked, launching herself at Abigail with the force of a small cannonball. You came back! Of course I came back, sweet girl. I'll always come back. Thomas was more reserved, trying to be grown up, but his relief was obvious. He wrapped his arms around Colt's legs and didn't let go for a full minute. That night, with all 3 children finally asleep and the house quiet, Colt and Abigail stood on their porch, the same porch where he'd first interviewed her 5 years ago, where she'd proven she could cook, where they'd fallen in love in increments too small to notice until suddenly it was everything. Do you ever think about that first day? Abigail asked. When I showed up covered in dust, demanding a job. Every day, Colt admitted. I think about how close I came to sending you away. How different my life would be if I had. Lonelier? Empty. Just empty. He pulled her close. You know what the best part is? After 5 years, 3 kids, and running this entire operation together, I still get excited when I hear your voice in the morning. Still look for you first when I come in from work. Still feel like the luckiest man alive that you chose me. We chose each other, Abigail corrected. That's what makes it work. And it did work. Not perfectly. Life never was perfect. But it worked in all the ways that mattered, with love that had been tested and proven, with partnership built on respect and trust, with a family that grew from desperation and determination into something neither had dared to hope for. The garden continued to grow, the ranch continued to prosper, the children grew tall and strong, learning their father's work ethic and their mother's compassion. And every evening, when the sun set over the Texas prairie, Colt played his guitar while Abigail sang, their voices blending in harmony that had taken 5 years to perfect but would last a lifetime. The sign above the gate never changed, Merriman and Rose Ranch, where spring came back to Texas. Because that's what Abigail had done. She'd brought spring to a place frozen in winter, hope to a man trapped in grief, and life to a ranch that had been merely surviving. And in return, Colt had given her something equally precious, a home where she belonged, a name she could be proud of, and the knowledge that she was loved not despite her past or her struggles, but because of everything she was and everything she'd overcome to get there. Together they'd built something that would outlast them both, not just a successful ranch or a revolutionary approach to healing, but a legacy of choosing hope over despair, love over fear, and possibility over resignation. And that in the end was the greatest gift two broken people could give each other, the courage to heal, the strength to grow, and the faith to believe that even in the hardest ground, with enough care and determination, beautiful things could bloom.